Hello and welcome to another fun-filled edition of Adam's Music Box. Well, as I've said before on this show, the saxophone is an instrument that is uniquely associated with 20th century music because it was invented in the 18th century, but the musical snobs, the musical elites of the day didn't take to it, not because they didn't like the sound per se, but because Adolf Sachs, the inventor of the instrument, didn't want to play ball with a lot of the publishing companies that owned a lot of the instrument making companies, and this led to the suppression of the saxophone in much of Europe. In America, though, it was a different story. The classical music world was less entrenched. Other forms of music were springing to life, and most notably, Thomas Edison and others enabled pop music to rise up and become a dominant form of commercialized music. And this gave opportunities for new instruments to be explored, whether the saxophone, the drum set. I mean, drums are an ancient instrument, but the modern drum set is from the early 20th century, electronic instruments later, and so on. Now, I say that all because there were many great saxophonists in the early 20th century and in the mid 20th century. Too many to name, but your Birds, your Coltrane's, your Pharoah Saunders, the list goes on and on and on. Your Wayne Shorters, but in the 70s came someone who turned the saxophone from an instrument that was part of pop music to an instrument that soloed in pop music, an instrument that people would associate with songs that, while instrumental in most cases, were nevertheless central to a jazz idiom expressed in the R&B, soul, and pop worlds. And I'm talking, of course, about the man pictured behind me, Grover Washington Jr. Such a talent, the tone, the lyricism. He had it all, and he could have stuck to the jazz world per se, but he did something that in retrospect we call soul jazz, which is essentially jazz sensibilities and jazz virtuosity at your fingertips, but presented in a kind of instrumental song structure that kind of, sort of, and sometimes directly mirrors the structure of a pop song that has a vocal lyric. And his first album, Inner City Blues, really established him as someone who was making music that was very user friendly. It was music that you could listen to and enjoy without having to strain or overthink. And yet it was still virtuosic. It was still really well produced, and it involved some of the finest musicians, session and jazz. Sometimes there's overlap around. Now, he continued to go from strength to strength throughout the 70s. The 1975 album, Mr. Magic, is sometimes thought of as a breakthrough album. That same year, he did Feel So Good, which also sold really well. And then he had a sort of second career that really, really made him a superstar. And this was with one of the finest produced albums of all time, 1980's Wine Light. And on this album, there's the song Just the Two of Us, which is a collaboration with the wonderful singer-songwriter Bill Withers. And this took the Grover Washington sound absolutely stratospheric. And from then on, he sort of owned saxophone in the 80s, and in many ways paved the way for people like David Sanborn to break out of the jazz fusion world and enter the pop world with his saxophone. I know he's not very popular among hardcore musicians, but you could say, and don't blame him for it, he paved the way for Kenny G, because Grover was the first person who used the saxophone like a singer would use their voice. Again, the lyricism, the pop sensibilities, the jazz chops. He had it all. So here's to you, Grover Washington, a man who truly put the saxophone where it belonged, right between the ears of so many listeners. Even if you haven't heard the name because you're under a certain age, you will have probably heard the sound. Like, subscribe, and we'll see you next time. Take care.